Came about, as Jez pointed out, is that I did put an advertisement on the first Holocaust Day of 2001. Remember, on Holocaust Day, remember there 4 million Palestinian refugees, and I put my post box, not expecting any reply. I got a reply from a man called Eric Lowe. And Eric Lowe had served in Palestine, 1945 to 48, and he invited me to Eden Camp, where they had their annual remembrance. And I got to know the gentlemen there. As a matter of fact, they gave me their tie, because I'm very proud to show you the tie, Palestine 1945 to 45, with the little witness cameras. And I wanted to persuade the BBC or anybody else I came across to record these men. But I couldn't get anyone to take an interest in recording these men. And at that time, up until that time, I hadn't made any films. I had actually been in films. I'd been in television commercials since age 15 and so on and so on. So I'd never been behind the camera, but I could find no one to record them. So in the end, I actually hired a broadcast camera quality and recorded them. And that is what you're going to see. But I want to say to you that of the 30 minutes that you're going to watch of very many interviews, just excerpts from interviews, I think you're going to agree with me that in Eric Lowe, who later on produced this book called The Forgotten Conscripts, he is our national treasure. There is a positive aspect to this entire story, and it's him. Because he shows us that as a man who was actually the lowest of the low in the army, an ordnance man, had a salt of the earth, had more going for him than the top brass and those who were making the policies. So sometimes it can be the case that the lowest of the low sometimes can be quite a leader. And this man is a leader, and I'm going to take an interest in your interest in whether you agree with me that this man is a national treasure. So without any further chat about it, let me start it off.
باسمك يا بلادي عالشمس الما بتغيب لمالي ولا ولادي على حبك ما في حبيب.
The following are excerpts from my first two telling films, screened in the House of Lords and the House of Commons in 2004. For over 50 years, untruths about the British in Palestine and about the Palestinians have been allowed to develop and flourish to the extent that the real truth is difficult to believe.
More than the world knows how the Zionists, how cruel and wicked they were. I mean, anything which stood on their way, had to go. And in our case, the Palestinians stood in their way. So what they done to the Palestinian people is just unacceptable. We are the Turkata activist here in London. The Turkata was founded in Jerusalem by beginning of when the Zionists came along, and it was a kind of headed by Rabbi Amram Blau.
What sort of period?
And I think it was in the 20s, and he was against Zionism.
And so your group is an international group? It's an
international group. It's not a matter of members. It's all organisation. It's just all volunteers who want to stick up and demonstrate. Before the state, that was when the Zionists were trying to build the state from the politically. from the world. And we had in Turkey we had someone called Dr. Yakov Dihan, and he was working very hard on the international scene to prevent the state from coming to being. He was assassinated by the Zionists in cold blood, and since his assassination, the Naturikata, his power went down. Israeli managed to win a propaganda war over the first years of its state, the founding of its state.
Turnspeak is what Norman Finkelstein says is how the things are portrayed. He says that turnspeak is the cynical inverting or distorting of facts. For example, making the victim appear a culprit.
The Zionists are extremely good at propaganda war, especially when they have the American media with them, and they're sophisticated and they look good, and the Arabs may be more traditional in religion and such things. And this is explained Dr. Professor Norman Finkelstein in his book. The Tragedy of Zionism, Walter Lacour wrote in his Standard History, was it appeared on the international scene when there were no longer empty spaces on the world map. This is not quite right. Rather, it was no longer politically tenable to create such spaces. Extermination had ceased to be an option of conquest.
What Dr. Finkelstein and all other prominent Jewish spokesmen failed to mention, then as now, is that from 1946, Jews worldwide had the option to go directly to the ever-safe and welcoming autonomous arms of their first Jewish homeland, founded in 1928 in the Jewish autonomous region called after its capital, Birobidzhan, a fertile region of 32,000 square kilometers, situated on Russia's southeast border, now a Jewish republic.
Israeli managed to win a propaganda war over the first years of its state, the founding of its state.
Turnspeak is what Norman Finkelstein says is how the things are portrayed. He says that turnspeak is the cynical inverting or distorting of facts. For example, making the victim appear a culprit.
The Zionists are extremely good at propaganda war, especially when they have the American media with them, and they're sophisticated and they look good, and the Arabs may be more traditional in religion and such.
The whole idea that there is some sort of action and reaction is very false. The action was that these people were thrown out of their lands that they lived in throughout the centuries. People who were thrown out of their own homes, and they were forced out, and a great deal of cruelty and a great deal of injustice was done to them. And not only that, but even the nations of the world, for whatever reasons that they thought correct or otherwise, they kept silent about it. The power of the Zionism was such that they had the whole world mesmerized by what they called success. And it's very difficult to believe that the people in the world accepted this fallacy. They have accepted that these came out from nowhere, and they turned into a blossoming Garden of Eden, something that was left by the Arabs who didn't care about it. This is all fallacy, and obviously it has only helped to aggravate the situation we have now. And the fact that these people have now become people who are willing to kill themselves, and we're talking about not some sort of yobbo in the street, but educated people who have everything to live for, and yet they're sacrificing themselves because they have for all these years been denied any way of sort of expressing their anger, any way of being able to say to the world, look, we are human beings, we have been wronged, why don't you do something about it? And so this was the final answer to it, to get the attention of the world. And it's a great shame that they could not do this simply by saying, look, we are being wronged, and the world didn't listen.
My experience of Haifa, with some idea of what was happening to the Palestinians for the last 53 years, indeed over the entire 20th century, caused me to be taken aback by the idea that Britain was about to institute, from 2001, an annual Holocaust Day, which in the present-day circumstances seemed inadvertently to endorse the grossest of hypocrisies. Given that those same people simultaneously were terrorizing, tyrannizing, and daily humiliating, by contrast, a politically inoffensive Palestinian population, systematically and long planned since 1896, when the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, wrote The Jewish State, an operations manual based on a literal old covenant with a racist God.
In divinely commanded war, such as the settlers in the occupied territories, one must destroy, kill, eliminate men, women and children, there being no place for any humanitarian considerations.
An Eretz or greater biblical Israel, which shall encompass far more Arab land than Palestine.
Well, actually the Israeli flag is still with the two blue stripes. And this means, of right and Nile. It's obvious.
Israel, I understand, has no borders. It's therefore an illegal state without stating its borders.
You can have one disputed border usually, but Israel didn't commit itself unilaterally to any borders. It didn't city map to the UN and give it its designation borders, and that's very dangerous for a state,
Yet most Zionists, like mostly secular Jews, do not believe in the God they use to justify their claim to a metaphysical Israel made literal as their promised land.
They wanted to rely on the Bible, and they didn't even believe in the Bible. Preaching something like choosing people, but they how can they believe in this verse?
Secular chosen, yeah.
However, it is rarely observed that Zionism predates Nazism by half a century.
The Zionists were very well aware that the ideology of Zionism, the fights that they've had in Russia and so on, none of them managed to achieve what they wanted to do because they weren't powerful enough to do so. So they needed to have guilt, and the only guilt that they could achieve is by getting this Jewish blood that they could barter with afterwards. And therefore they, as you say, that they had set up this secular covenant to spill the Jewish blood in order for them to be able to then barter it later on with the nations of the world as a guilt money, as blood money, liable for getting their end.
Rabbis of the West Bank have the journal, they declared in the journal, the Nakuda journal it's called, they said, those among us who call for humanitarian attitude towards our Arab neighbors are reading the halakha, religious law, selectively and avoiding specific commandments. I'm wondering who is avoiding the basic of Judaism.
We call them not rabbis, we call them traitors.
For example, this is the diaries of Theodor Herzl. Right, he writes like this: we shall make disappear, spirit the Palestinians pour across the border, unnoticed, by procuring employment for them in transit countries, whilst denying it its own country. The process of expropriation and removal must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. So this is relevant to nowadays. What the politicians of today should really be honest and go to the root cause of all the bloodshed, and realize it's no favour for the Jewish people. What the Zionims, it's just thought the Herzl brought a misfortune to the Jewish people.
Israel, can you give me your definition of anti-Semitism?
Yes, anti-Semites are the people who doubt or deny inherent benevolence of the Jews to Gentile society.
I'm not in favor of indulging in comparative martyrology. And anyway, I don't know of any criteria of measurement of pain, how to quantify and measure suffering. And I believe that we, the Palestinians, are not children of the lesser God.
So I placed a personal announcement in the columns of the Times and the Daily Telegraph, which read, "On Holocaust Day, remember there 4 million Palestinian refugees." Mr. Eric Lowe answered my announcement and very kindly sent me some copies of his Palestine Scrapbook, in which he had invited many of his comrades to give eyewitness accounts of their experiences whilst serving in Palestine up to 1948. I have met many of his comrades at Fort Nelson and Eden Camp, and since they were wishing to put the record straight, to dispute some of the turnspeak we'd been presented for so long,
I've been a little bit reluctant to come here and talk to you in this vein because of Jewish friends that I've met and become mates with in this country, and I feel as though they might think that, hello, what's happened to old Jeffrey? Has he gone anti-Semite all of a sudden? You know. No, I haven't. But that's what happened. And
well, just as King Ibn Saud said in a letter to, many letters actually, to Roosevelt and Truman, that no country, what country, would deliberately allow into it foreigners who wanted to become the majority and to rule that country. And his wisdom, we really do need to keep going back to the beginning of the period to see what was the prompt, the cause, as opposed to being deflected to the result.
the average British soldier who'd been sent to Palestine was rather bewildered, having lived in Britain for 5 years and fought a war against the Germans, who were the people responsible for killing Jews in Europe. We would have thought that we and the Jews had common cause, and having arrived in Palestine and found that we were being not just snubbed by the Jewish population, we didn't expect to be treated as heroes or deliverers, but we were treated as enemies, and we were being shot and bombed, and it was just complete bafflement. You know, why?
I thought it would be interesting to get Philip Knightley to interview Mr. Lowe. Mr. Knightley had worked for 20 years on the Sunday Times. Having written a history on war correspondence from the late 19th century about how they'd had to deal with imposed mendacity and censure, yet 1945 to 1948, that period, was not in his book. It is a war and a period, for some reason, that we were not to hear about.
Eric Lowe.
I was relieved when my time to go in the forces came along. I was 18, it came almost on my birthday. I was called up, and we weren't surprised. We had thought that war had ended and conscription would end with it, but it didn't end. Within 3 or 4 months, I was called for overseas posting. had rather extended leave, various injections, and eventually on the 17th of February we set sail for Palestine.
What was happening when you got there?
Well, it was a trouble of a degree I never thought possible. We come through Egypt. People were hostile in Egypt. The trains had shutters on, so they could stop throwing things into the windows. The climate got better as we went through Rafah. We had sights of the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. It seemed peaceful. The Arabs which greeted the trains, selling us fruit, their vegetable, their eggs, their bread, they all seemed very pleasant, totally different from the ones we'd seen in Egypt. And then when we got there, we were whipped to a camp, Camp 153, and we were told of the troubles. The first thing I was told was that the problem here, it is like as if the Romans were coming back to Britain and claiming Britain for themselves.
The Romans being the Jewish refugees coming to Palestine from all over Europe.
Yes, we'd seen the Jewish refugees on films. We'd heard them on the radio and everything. You were horror-struck with what was going on. You know, we felt sympathy for them.
Professor Robert Forrison.
Many European Jews died as a result of wartime actions, and notably in the typhus epidemic. But many Jews survived, and in their millions dispersed throughout the world, going as far as to create and people a new state, just 3 years later, that of Israel in 1948.
But then you realise that this Palestine was no bigger than Wales. Very small, it was a poor country, and they were expected to tolerate that, the numbers going like that.
Why were they going there? I mean, Britain promised a national home to the world's Jewry if they went to Palestine?
It was a letter from Lord Balfour to Baron Rothschild, promising them a homeland, not a state, a homeland. But he did add something that's got forgotten, not to the detriment of the indigenous population. You saw these people, pitiful they were, and you felt sorry for them, but then you realised these people were terrible. They were throwing bombs into open trucks, and it started in 1945 apparently, and worsened as the time went on. In December 45, just to show a strength, the Irgun joined forces with the Haganah, and they did 100 bombs on various installations, police stations, railways, everywhere.
These were terrorists you're talking about?
Oh, entirely terrorists. In fact, the first people they killed on that thing were Jews and Arabs.
Now, what was the aim of all this? I mean, what were these Jewish terrorist organisations trying to achieve?
The British government wanted to limit the number of refugees coming in, and they didn't want to. One incident that happened, the ship pulled into Haifa, and Britain was turning these ships back and sending them off to various destinations. And so that it wouldn't be turned back, the Jews planted a bomb in the engine room to disable the ship. Unfortunately, it more than disabled it, it was crowded with refugees. They sank it. They killed these refugees. They killed 1 or 2 Britons that were on. My friend Bill Taylor was on that ship. He was thrown into the sea, and for initially they couldn't believe that it had been done by their own people, by the Stern Gang.
The Stern Gang, of course, became a notorious terrorist organisation.
Yes, well, they were active in a way during the war. I mean, the Stern Gang was started by Abraham Stern. And in fact, he was advising people not to join the British Army, but to fight the arch enemy, which was Britain. And they were publishing leaflets and everything, and robbing banks. And in 1942, Menachem Begin came to Palestine from Poland, looking to fight freedom for what he called his country, and he took leadership of the Stern Gang.
Could you tell me something about the way that Jewish terrorists bombed the King David Hotel?
I knew about it because everybody was talking about it. It had been up to that point the worst atrocity. 91 people killed, many of them Arabs, probably more Arabs, simply because they were killed on a bus that was passing. Jews were killed in it, very few British soldiers. And what they did, they dressed as Arabs, and they took 7 milk churns into the basement of the hotel. They were packed with dynamite. And then they let off a petard outside, a small bomb, to, as they say, keep people away. But that's when that small bomb went off, it actually killed more people, simply because on the military wing, they went out to the windows to see what had gone off in the street. That wing then collapsed, and that killed more. At the beginning of 1947, a man called Dov Gruner had been arrested with a gun in his hand, and he was part of a raid on a bank. And he had been, I gather, in the British Army, but he was now part of the terrorists. And he was wounded and captured and duly hanged. And then they kidnapped 2 British sergeants, Martin and Pace. They were in the intelligence corps. At first, I think Britain was reluctant to say they were in the intelligence corps. They were talking to a Jew at a cafe, off duty, when they were kidnapped. They were hanged by one man in particular, a man called Paglin. And the Royal Engineer officer that went to cut them down was injured by a mine placed in the ground below him. And, of course, there was terrible rage. 6th Airborne Division were going to rebel. The ones that were stationed at Tel Aviv, the men were talking of mutiny. And the officers, hearing of this, secretly locked all the weapons up. British politicians, Jewish politicians were enraged, saying them, those people that did it were going to be brought to justice. The Jewish agency had promised this. They never were brought to justice. In fact, Paglin became a minister for anti-terrorism in the post-war years.
It must have been clear by this time that the aim of the Jewish terrorists was to drive the British out of Palestine, leaving the road clear for these terrorists to settle whatever accounts they had with the Arabs.
Well, even then, the partition was talked of, and we thought that the Arabs didn't want partition. They were very open about not wanting partition. It was their country, and they didn't want to give one little bit of it.
Everyone knows, but not everyone sees, that there is no solution to the question. No solution. I do not know what Arab will agree, that Palestine should belong to the Jews.
But what we didn't know was that the Jews didn't want a partition. In fact, in 1944, they'd already killed Lord Moyne, the Minister for Colonial Affairs that was responsible for partition, when he was in Cairo. These people wanted to turn a free society into a restricted, single culture society, a racial state, and the ethnic cleansing was planned before ever they had their War of Independence. In fact, it was started before they had their War of Independence. The whole of the plain from Tel Aviv up to Haifa was cleared of Arab settlements first. Some were massacred and some fled. All the British troops began to hate the Jews. They began to write songs about them. And it all comes back. If you went to Eden Camp and really get to talk to the people, they don't like talking about it. They've been bullied by 50 years of never-ending propaganda. And of course, always, the core of it's the sympathy they had for the suffering that the Jews had during the war. It wasn't the Arabs. that put them in concentration camps.
You refer to the people who served with you and yourself in Palestine at that time as the forgotten army.
If you've seen it anywhere, if you've heard it mentioned on Armistice Day, or paraded, the number of lives lost in Palestine, as anywhere, other people have claimed forgotten armies, but we really were the forgotten armies. On the question of the 100,000 men that were tied up in Palestine, I think it should be pointed out that only a handful of them, by comparison, were actually acting as peacekeepers, keeping the Jewish terrorists in order, whilst Ruth Gruber jubilantly announced that the handful of freedom fighters were successfully keeping check on 100,000 crack troops. Was totally, we were not crack troops. Most of us were clerks. They were little boys. They were 18-year-olds, and they were doing clerical work, drivers, mechanics, and storemen, and that what formed the Royal Army Ordnance Corps and the Royal Electrical Engineers. The other men were the infantry people, and they were doing it, and they did a grand job keeping down against what turned out to be, although you didn't, as time went by, you realised it wasn't just the terrorists, there was everyone. No one ever gave anyone away, no one ever surrendered anything. They all concealed arms, they all concealed terrorists, whereas once they got back into their quarters, they were lost, and very difficult. And so you were in effect against the entire Jewish population. It got to the level where you couldn't trust the Jewish employees.
I've heard, Mr. Lowe, from people in Haifa that the Kiryat Beach Cemetery, where the British were buried, I believe, up until 1945, that the wall of that cemetery has now been moved back many feet, and that the sign is now put inside the gate, so that it appears that the witness, even the dead witness, appears to be being eliminated from history.
Yes, I didn't know about the wall being moved. I'm not at all surprised. I mean, I know that they've had a little regard for the established cemeteries anyway. There are several cemeteries in Palestine. Most of them were from some in Jerusalem, for example, from the First World War. But this one, the Kiryat Beach Cemetery in particular, it's one that concerned us because it was nearest to our camp. In fact, one of our camps, our sub-depots, was right on the perimeter of that camp. Eric Long, one old comrade who's since sadly died, you may have seen him at Fort Nelson. He was on the first trip to Fort Nelson. He went back to see, and he was very alarmed to read on the sign that it didn't mention anyone that had died after 1939, and yet many were. To find they weren't even mentioned, no mention was made at all about the British soldiers that died between 1945 and 1948. Yet the graves are in there, and
it's almost like you disappear, like the Palestinians.
It is. It comes back to this basic question of why should that be? You know, why can't we have this recognition? And the whole thing, the two are tied together. The recognition for us and the appreciation of what the Palestinians have lost. You know, I think it's one of those sad things of history that they hope they won't, but the Palestinians won't let it die, and we won't let it die until the last of us is gone. They didn't think it was going to happen. That's why Al-Nakba was a disaster for them. It just happened. The final chapter in their country being stolen, by stealth and eventually by brutal force.
We know that's not true. Exactly, the BBC, and the reason why they wouldn't screen that film is because the BBC is hideously Jewish. And yes, when Eric Lowe was told we were laying that wreath today, there were tears in his eyes, tears of happiness in those blind eyes. Eric Lowe is a national treasure, a good man. And Lady Michele Renouf is a good woman.